Hello. Hi, Rebecca. Lovely to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ramesh.
Thank you so much for taking a few minutes here. For those of you who don't know me, Ramesh Srinivasan, I'm the president of the Akanksha Education Fund Board, and I'm really thrilled to have a special guest with me today, a very dear friend, Rebecca Winthrop from Brookings. Rebecca is a preeminent scholar who's been studying the role of public education institutions and the value they hold for society. And she's published a lot on this topic of the role of an education institution in a pandemic. Welcome, Rebecca, and thank you so much for taking a few minutes.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So maybe, Rebecca, I'll just start with just if you could tell us in your view, what is the role of an education institution during a pandemic?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and I have some strong opinions about it, in part informed by evidence and research, of course, but also informed by my field experience. And you may not know this, Ramesh, but prior to going to a doctoral program and getting my PhD and all this and that and coming to Brookings, I worked in education in humanitarian contexts. So I was very informed, that was very formative for me. And one of the things that I think I took away was that schools can play an incredibly important role in community development and in times of crisis and emergency in terms of sort of caretaking for the whole community. And in fact, if schools don't play that role, they won't be able to succeed with educating their kids when the social fabric is disrupted and there's crises happening. So it's actually, I think it really behooves education institutions to sort of stand up and say, we are a pillar community development organization in this community. And from a policy angle, I think governments should be supporting schools to do that around the world, because there's no other institution that has the reach into almost every single little community in the world that schools do.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very helpful perspective. What does this mean for Akanksha? And I know you've studied Akanksha for many years. An organization like Akanksha that works in communities in India through a public-private partnership model, what does it mean for an institution like us?
Well, I wonder what Akanksha wants to do long term, but I think in the short term, it really means that Akanksha has to think about its core mission, which is educating the most marginalized children, as I certainly understand and have followed the work for many years, in an ecosystem of what helps a child develop. There's lots of scientific literature on child development that emphasizes that children do not learn and develop in isolation. And you have to think first and foremost about all the interactions that children have with the family, with teachers and communities, with neighborhoods. And then you have to think about sort of the ever expanding layers that affect those adults that impact those children. And so I actually think that's not a bad way in the long term to think about the lens with which you should think about educating children anyways. And in fact, if there's one tiny, tiny silver lining to this horrible crisis and the terrible impact on families and people's lives and communities everywhere, it is the possibility that this sort of more holistic idea of the role of a school and how children develop could be seeded in people's minds. And as you know, I talk a lot about leapfrogging. Could this maybe be a moment sort of post-crisis some years hence to really transform how we do schooling, that yes, attends to children's academic development for sure, but helps build the fabric for their well-being, their holistic physical, social, emotional well-being, which is absolutely crucial to children's academic success.
That's very helpful. And as you know, that holistic education very much fits into the Akanksha mission and values. Like I mentioned to you, most of our donors, majority, I would say even 80–90% of our donors are very excited about that direction. There is a small minority, maybe 10–20%, who would then ask the question, How does Akanksha guard against mission creep? How would you respond to that? What advice would you have for us, Rebecca?
Yeah, well, I would say, they're doing their job as good stewards of their funds and of a program to ask questions. And I think it's a very good question. And I guess, I'm not in the organization, I'm not on the board, but from afar and seeing this question asked in other contexts, not just Akanksha, I would say that if Akanksha decided, wow, during COVID, we're going to, work on vaccine hesitancy. We're going to work on a whole range of things that's really around emergency support, humanitarian aid, helping the community survive from the COVID crisis. And afterwards, and not do anything around children's education and learning. And afterwards, we're just going to become a health organization. I would say that's probably not very smart. That's not your comparative advantage. That is mission creep. But if Akanksha keeps at the central vision of its mission, the child is learning and his or her learning and development, and then just has sort of a broader mindset around, frankly, to me, it sounds like empowering Akanksha staff on the ground to be flexible, to really decide, of those outer rings that shape children's learning and development at specific moments in time. You might need to lean in more on one element at one point, such as, addressing vaccine hesitancy and helping with children's safety, maybe more at this period in time than you would have naturally. But I do think that flexible muscle and adaptation to sort of surge and do what's needed in the community to make sure kids are whole and families are whole, so kids can learn, is a good muscle to have, because this is not going to be the first pandemic, as sad as it seems to say, amidst what the terrible crisis is going on in India. We're going to see this show again. It could also be environmental impacts. All the evidence shows that we have to start preparing our social institutions to be more nimble and flexible, and to have that muscle to sort of respond where it's needed, while still keeping at the center that core vision. So I think that sounds to me like what your response is. If it's not, I would suggest that be Akanksha's response. And to me, that isn't mission creep. That's just really preparing and being quite forward-footed on what 21st century social institutions need to do.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very helpful. I wanted to switch a little bit from the short term to the long term. Obviously, right now we're focused on being there for our communities and evolving our model, as you said, being nimble and agile. We're also beginning to think about the long term and what we should do. I know you've given a lot of thought to this concept of leapfrogging. If you could just touch for a few minutes, what does that concept mean as you take a long-term lens? If you had any thoughts or questions or things we should think about as Akanksha.
Yeah, well, it's something I've been quite passionate about for some time. So you could call it systems transformation, which I think sounds sort of overwhelming and complicated. When I talk about leapfrogging, really what I mean is thinking differently about how you put the pieces of an education system together differently, and really sort of expanding our minds. So not being trapped by sort of dominant logic of this is what a school looks like, this is what a teacher should do every day, this is what student experience should be. And think about what young people need to learn in the 21st century, both core academic competence and these 21st century skills, and who can provide it to them, and what are the social structures. And it might look very different from what a normal school would look like. Akanksha is already an innovator. I wanted to say before we close that we have been doing, your funders should know, we have been doing research in India on parent engagement, and we've been doing lots of focus groups. And I've just been coding and looking at the focus groups, and some of them are in communities where Akanksha schools are, and parents, and this is not Akanksha, that is not through donors, it's through Brookings independent research. Parents of Akanksha who go to Akanksha schools are glowing about how wonderful they are and how meaningful their approach is. So I would say Akanksha has a lot to give others. And I would say embrace sort of the creative ideas of how to make things happen, whether it's widening the profile of who an educator is, meaning pairing trained educators with community folks, whether it's thinking differently about how, where and how children master certain skills, whether that's collaboration skills outside of school or perhaps literacy skills through adaptive learning in the home, just think more broadly and then see what works and try to sustain that. And really leapfrogging is finding the classic leapfrog, of course, is thinking about, I started this work thinking about, what would an equivalent jump look like from the telecommunications sector, say in sub-Saharan Africa, which didn't lay, copper wire and landlines and went straight to mobile phones, and all of a sudden unleashed all sorts of things, including financial inclusion for rural folks through mobile banking, et cetera. What would that look like in education? And knowing that it's not a tech app, but it's more of a creative model by drawing on, yes, educational expertise that have been the spine traditionally of schools, but also all sorts of community resources that now, and supports and enrichments that have now, during COVID in many countries, risen up to support children's learning, whether they're families and parents, new ways of harnessing grandparents, whether it's media companies, health industries, all sorts. And let's make sure that that doesn't fade away post-COVID. And I think Akanksha could try to really be on the forefront of looking at what those new models are, because they have this flexibility with public-private partnership. And I would encourage Akanksha to think about sort of modeling itself and piloting and testing some of those new models and seeing how to scale them to other places.
Thank you, Rebecca. Firstly, appreciate your input on the parent feedback. As you know, we've been investing in that a lot. It's good to get independent confirmation and look forward to discussing that more. And then really appreciate some of the long-term ideas that you're putting on the table. We will definitely be sure to think about them even as we are experimenting for the short term. Some of the ideas around parent engagement, working with partners, being part of the ecosystem to have transformational impact definitely are great ideas for us to explore further, Rebecca.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for making the time today. Really, really appreciate your inputs.
Of course, and I'm happy to, and best of luck. And you guys are doing incredible work in an incredibly difficult time. So I wish you all the speed and luck.
Thank you very much.